Let's talk brave veterans, brutal war leaders, and alien monstrosities, with an overview of the best melee units for every army in Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're doing another one of our every army in 40k overviews, and this time I thought it would be fun to take a look at the cracked combat troops of every single race in the galaxy. Despite being set in the far future, it still seems that the majority of armies in the game still prefer to get to work with crackling power weapons and razor-sharp talons. There's certainly something cooler about breaking your foe apart in glorious melee combat compared with just shooting them at range. With that in mind, we'll go through each faction for the game, talk about perhaps my top choice for best melee unit in the codex, what they're armed with, and a few reasons as to why they might work quite so well, and also cover a few of the other near misses as well, perhaps other challengers for the top spot. First up, we'll start with the Space Marines, the standard datasheets from the codex first, and then go through a few specific chapters that have their own units. For the core codex, I think it's still hard to beat the trusty Vanguard veterans, jump pack born elites of the chapter, who have full access to the various relic weapons in the chapter's armory, and can bring some very powerful gear into battle. Vanguard veterans are very fast with their jump packs, bounding up the board from cover to cover before shredding the opponent in combat. They're often armed with lightning claws or thunder hammers. Lightning claws shred infantry with strength 4, AP 2 and re-rolling wound rolls, and thunder hammers are very strong and a bit unwieldy, but a big damage 3 is really great to be having in 40k at the moment. They'll certainly both be amped up a fair bit by their assault doctrine by the time the Marine army gets to turn 3 onwards. You can take a fun relic blade on the sergeant for strength 7, AP 3 and damage 2, and often storm shields tend to be a fairly popular pick. Having a 2+ save to go against AP 0 is pretty nice, and also catching high AP on the 4+ invul doesn't hurt either. Maybe a little bit more take or leave post Armour of Contempt, but still very nice durability wise. They've got great synergy with a whole bunch of chapters, whether it's Blood Angels +1 to wound or White Scars +1 damage, and they can also throw in a cheeky melter bomb as well. 1 command point for potentially 2d3 mortal wounds on a vehicle is something very scary. Otherwise, out of the core codex, Marines have plenty of assault units. Maybe Blade Guard veterans might be one of the best contenders on the Primaris front. Very tanky with their storm shields and transhuman physiology, +3 wounds and damage 2 relic weapons. And Terminators are really quite nice now with Armour of Contempt, plus a fair few different ways that you can field them. Maybe relic Terminators with combi bolters and lightning claws or chain fists. Of course, a lot of chapters have their own specific fighting styles, so I thought we'd just go through some of the more divergent ones that have quite a lot of their own units. For Dark Angels, basically anything that's a Deathwing Terminator is phenomenally dangerous. Now the Deathwing Knights dropped in points down to 43 points, I think they're looking a lot more threatening. They're just as cheap as the standard Deathwing Assault Terminators with Thunderhammers and Storm Shields, but they're massively more threatening with 3 attacks, a Strength 8 -2 and damage 3, hitting on 2s with these guys rather than 4s for Thunderhammers. Even if you've got good saves, then there's generally not that much in the game that's going to laugh off a squad of these hitting, particularly when they're buffed up with things like Righteous Repugnance for re-rolling hits, or if they manage to get into the Dark Angels Assault Doctrine. Dark Angels Terminators are ridiculously tough as well, getting permanent transhuman physiology all the time. That's on top of a 2+ save with +1 from the Storm Shield, and potentially more if you can get them cover. And if you want to take their durability to the next level, then you can use that Pennant of Remembrance for -1 damage, and potentially have a nearby apothecary for healing injured members of the squad and setting up dead ones when they die. You could also give one of those characters Rights of War as well, and then they'll be just as obsec as their other Deathwing brothers. For the Blood Angels, while the Death Company might be very scary, I think it's hard to choose anything else but the Sanguinary Guard at the moment, a unit that was kind of amazing already at 32 points after Armour of Contempt, but then Games Workshop dropped them down to 30, so now they're just ridiculously strong. They're really fast with jump packs and their +1 to charge from their Blood Angels chapter tactic, and they might well also be able to pick up the +2-inch move from the relic on one of their nearby Sanguinary Ancients. Having +2 move on a Blood Angels army gets them where they need to go. In this era of Terminators, they're typically going to be most commonly armed with Oncoming Swords, Strength 5, AP 3 and Damage 2, 4 attacks with +1 to wound on the charge from Blood Angels, and potentially if they get into the Assault Doctrine, they're going to get extra attacks and extra AP on top of that. They're tough with a 2+ save and Armour of Contempt, which gets better in cover. They're -1 to hit in melee with those Death Masks, and they also get +1 to hit with their own weapons when they're near the Warlord. Finally, they're really good at defending objectives. Plonk them down on an objective, and they'll be able to defend it pretty well by jumping up with a heroic intervention stratagem, as not a lot really wants to be fighting these guys in melee if they can avoid it. Overall, they're crazily strong. Not too surprising to see a lot of Blood Angels lists bringing 3 big squads of them. Next up for the Space Wolves, they do have the Thunder Wolves and Wolfen, but I still think that the trusty Wolf Guard with the jump packs are still probably the best unique unit. I guess in general these guys do function very similar to the more standard Vanguard veterans, but Space Wolves have some excellent support for them. Often Space Wolf armies like to field them as a successor chapter with +1 to hit on the charge and exploding 6s from Whirlwind of Rage. Then you can double down on that with Savage Fury for yet more exploding 6s, and then if you combine that either with Chaplain full rerolls to hit or Chapter Master full rerolls to hit, then you can just reroll all the dice and fish for those 6s. Each one of them will get you 3 hits. Then maybe add in some fast support characters. You could have the Armour of Russ for making enemies that they charge fight last, Murderous Hurricane from a Wolf Priest to do the same, or buff up their melee with Instincts Awoken for the Assault Doctrine early, or the Wolfenstone for more attacks. Utterly brutal, and they even have other melee stratagems as well, like +1 to wounds. They really are a unit where you can have a unit of 5 of them with jump packs, and they just absolutely maul virtually whatever they touch if they do get to fight to full effect. Deathwatch next. I think that their biggest melee threat is going to be some version of the melee Proteus kill team, the one with the standard Firstborn Marines with all the flexible loadouts. Deathwatch veterans can carry all sorts of eclectic gear into battle. There's plenty of options in the squad. You could think about going for a combat squatted approach where you take a bunch with shotguns or something to camp home field objectives and then send some bikers or Vanguard vets out on their own. Or you could go for an entire melee approach for the squad, say 5 veterans with Storm Shields and Lightning Claw, 2 Vanguard veterans with heavy Thunderhammers, which are massive damage 4 and AP3, perhaps a couple of Terminators for tanking with Armour of Contempt, and maybe a biker to allow you to fall back and charge if you need to. You can also do some interesting melee shenanigans with a few of them moving a bit faster, particularly the biker's big base can allow you to make some very long charges, and they'll be able to strike out a lot further than they really should be able to for essentially a foot infantry squad. Then Deathwatch have got access to a whole load of surprisingly potent buffs in the combat phase. They can get 4 rerolls to hit and fight first from a psychic spell. They get to choose the order of their assault doctrines, so they'll often have more AP than they should in the early game. You can fill them in such a way to borrow a turn of advance and charge from the White Scars tactic, and they can be very tough as well with Storm Shields, a 5+ feel no pain, and their objectives secured because they're troops. Definitely not a unit to be trifled with, even if Deathwatch are a bit more known for their close range shooting than their melee. Finally, and sticking with the black-clad Space Marines, we have the Black Templars, and the Primaris Crusader squad is currently looking better than ever as a very solid core to the army. With a base of 10 models, you can get a squad for 178 points. That will give you a mix of initiates and neophytes, usually all armed with Astartes chainswords, and now most of their war gear upgrades are free as well, so you can get 2 free Power Fists, as well as the Sword Brothers sword. It's really not bad damage output for a hardy trooper squad that's going to be securing objectives hard. And if you want to add yet more threat into the squad, you could upgrade one of those Power Fists to the Fist of Balthus for a damage 3 Power Fist, or you could use those Relic Bearers for durability upgrades. You could also make a massively enhanced Sword Brother as well, use the Champion of the Feast stratagem and give him a Relic Sword. Then usually they're going to want to be standing next to a bunch of their fighty characters. Things like Helbrex and Grimoldus are pretty excellent to have at the middle of an army. You can get a litany for a 5+ feel no pain and 1 for mortal wounds in melee. Helbrecht can grant them 4 rerolls and +1 to their strength, and he can make them even hardier with things like their 5+ invul save from a vow, or their 4+ invul save for a single turn with their relic. The Templars do big stacked infantry squads like this better than most, I think. These guys are a seriously threatening prospect to see on the other side of the table. Moving on from Space Marines now, and we come to the Sisters of Battle. I must admit I struggle to choose for these girls, so I've nominated both the Sisters Repentia and the Zephyrim, which I think are really close in power at the moment for very different reasons. They're both fairly fragile and hard-hitting melee units, but have kind of different flavours and roles. First up, the Repentia are the Sisters in Exile, seeking a noble death in combat with their massive chainswords. They're 2 attacks base, rerolling the hits natively, and hit at strength 5, AP3, damage 2. They don't exactly give these penitent sisters all that much armour, so once they're out in the open, they're really quite easy to remove. But the sisters just have so many buffs that make them hit massively harder, plus a fair few reliable ways of getting them into combat. First up, you can have a Repentia Superior to make them advance and charge, and extra damage like reroll 1s. Morven Val could potentially give her rerolls to wound if it made sense, though they already get to reroll to hit anyway. Perhaps the most common of these sisters' sacred rites is the Passion, exploding 6s to hit, which works great on Repentia due to their hit rerolls. It means that they're going to get more 6s than normal. And you could have a very cheap 25-point priest nearby and give them +1 attack to amp them up to 3. Then the vast majority of Sisters lists seem to be playing Bloody Rose at the moment because they just make melee so much more dangerous. They get yet another extra attack, so potentially up to 4 with Warhim, an extra AP to AP minus 4, and then a couple of really nasty damage dealing stratagems, 1 command point for 6s to hit auto wounding, and 1 command point for +1 damage on wound rolls of 6. They'll generally already obliterate elite infantry, but this allows them to really tangle with the heaviest units in the game. Then in terms of delivering them, you can potentially have them hiding behind terrain and advance and charge them with that Repentia Superior, maybe feed in a Miracle Dice for a 6 to advance perhaps to give them a very potentially long charge. You could have them popping out of Rhinos, which Bloody Rose can move up pre-game, or you could even put them in strategic reserve and again feed in a high Miracle Dice, and then feed in a Miracle Dice to give them a very good chance of making a long charge. A unit of these can potentially mess up something that's far greater than its points value, even if the opponent is quite likely to kill it in return unless you hide them carefully. Otherwise though, with Zephyrim going down to 15 points, I think it wouldn't have been right not to talk about them as well. They move faster than the Repentia with 12-inch movement with their jump packs. They can take a pennant for re-rolling charges, and they typically hit with 3 attacks at strength 4, AP 3 and damage 1. Certainly less damage against most heavy targets, but then they can get the vast majority of the buffs that the Repentia can get that we've already talked about, plus they really like Val's re-rolls with their low strength, and they have their own +1 to wound stratagem as well if you needed that. Then, unlike the Repentia with a 3+ save, Armour of Contempt and a 5+ invul, they might well be able to survive a bit more punishment in return, particularly if you can have them finishing in light cover or something. Overall, 2 very scary units indeed, not hard to see why people are bringing multiples of both in strong Bloody Rose lists. Golden Boys next, and for the shining Auramite of the Adeptus Custodes, I've chosen the Contemptor Achilles Dreadnought as perhaps one of the most solid melee threats of the Codex. The Forge World Contemptors are very scary tanky beasts indeed, toughen a 7 with a 2+ save, a 6+ feel no pain and -1 damage, so they aren't going to be removed particularly trivially, and they'll need quite a lot of high damage anti-tank weapons. That enormous Dread Spear in combat strikes with 5 attacks hitting on 2s, and strength 14, AP 3 and a big damage D3+3, potentially with some easy rerolls either from characters, his own stratagem for rerolling 1s for 1 CP, and potentially Emperor's Chosen rerolls too. Otherwise, kind of like most Custodes, he does a little bit of shooting as well, a couple of decent anti-tank shots, plus some Adrathic Destructors that you can upgrade to for strength 5, AP 3 and damage 3 shooting. In reality, it means that you can't truly ignore him at range either, which is quite a decent advantage. Otherwise, to get even more out of this big Contemptor, you can use the Eternal Penitent stratagem for +1 attack and re-rolling charges. That's quite nice to amp up their melee, that could be quite good on a Galatus too. And if you did have a phalanx of these stomping up the board, then having one of the Vexillas to make them a little bit tougher might not be the worst, maybe the Magnifica for -1 to hit. Overall, a very scary little dreadnought, should be able to dice up the majority of vehicles and characters in the game in a single round of combat. For the Adeptus Custodes though, the vast majority of the Codex is at least somewhat good in melee. Maybe some of the other really nice picks might be a Shield Captain on Dawn Eagle Jetbike with Tip of the Spear and some Warlord traits and relics, moving ridiculously fast and strike it strength 7 with +1 to wound with re-rolling 1s is really nice. Custodian Guard themselves are a pretty threatening battle line. Even the basic troops will do very good work against medium infantry. I could have easily talked about the Contemptor Galatus Dreadnought as well, the Achilles' brother-in-arms with the shield and the Great Blade, a little bit tankier and a bit more suited to fighting medium infantry maybe. And of course Trajan Valoris himself, strength 10, damage 3 and AP 3, and getting to fight twice with the Moment Shackle if he needs to. Admech next, and I don't really have too much hesitation in ranking the Sicarian Ruststalkers first for their codex. They were perhaps already one of the most competitive Admech units out there, and then Games Workshop dropped them in points slightly. The Sicarians are the fast-moving and high-tech bionics warriors, with long legs to stride across the dunes and catch their enemies in a fight. They do move very fast for infantry, getting 8-inch base and ignore negative modifier penalties, and if you do need to deliver them, then jumping out of a dune rider isn't the worst way to go either, can give them a little bit more protection until they get in close. In combat, I typically want to take them with the Transionic Blades, strength 5, AP 3 and damage 1, and every wound roll of a 6 does a mortal wound, which is going to make them pretty good against most targets. Then, Admech being Admech, they've got all sorts of synergies that you can put with them. They've got stratagems for +1 attack and +1 strength, both of which might be great depending on the target. They can take in-squad relics such as the Tempocopia to make the enemy fight last, always handy to prevent being interrupted, or one that can grant exploding 6s to hit. The vast majority of the Doctriners will be pretty handy for them as well. Extra movement is great, extra saves are okay if they've already made it to their target, and extra damage in combat is a no-brainer. And they can get further buffs from things like rerolls from Marshals or Forge World buffs such as Riser or Mars. There's an awful lot of things that you can stack on them in the Admech Codex. Then Ruststalkers are perhaps one of the most relevant units for this Skitarii veteran cohort. It allows them to advance and charge for a stratagem which gives them crazy threat range and an extra +1 attack strat and some Doctrina manipulation, maybe making these guys go faster when the rest of the army is in Bulwark or something. Defense wise, I'd say they're not exactly outstanding. 2 wounds at toughness 3 with a 5+ invul's okay. They do get +1 to their cover saves if they are in light cover or something. And I guess with things like Bulwark and certain relics they can be made to be abnormally tanky, though it might be a little bit tricky to coordinate that with also getting into combat. Overall, definitely a unit that requires some investment, but can be absolutely brutal if they do manage to get to their targets right. Otherwise, within the Codex, I think the next 2 don't really challenge them too hard, but Sindonian Dragoons are certainly general purpose, high strength melee damage units, they move pretty fast, and the Fulgurite Electro Priests seem similar to the Ruststalkers, but a bit more high damage, but less durability. Again, they could be okay with jumping out of Dune Riders. They've got a Fight's Last stratagem, and they're also a little bit cheaper as they also went down in points. Guard next, and on a list of melee units, I think that they're always going to be struggling a bit. In general, their most efficient units just tend to be shooting ones, and only limited stuff does combat at all, let alone doing it well. I still perhaps rank Bulgrin as the single highest melee threat out of the Guard Codex. They're one of the few units that you can properly build around to give them a whole load of buffs if you want to, and they can be very tanky and at least hit somewhat hard. They're 30 points a model, and get 4 attacks each with a Bulgrin Maul on the charge, strength 7, AP -1 and damage 2, so kind of like autocannons. Going to be very good against some targets, but less so against others. If you were using a big squad of them, it might make sense to give them +1 attack from Minister and Priest, but perhaps the area that they really shine in is being able to just get to absolutely silly saves in terms of their ranged durability. An Astropath with Psychic Barrier with +1 to their saves, combine it with their 2+ save on those slab shields, and then they can also use Take Cover for 1 CP for a further +1, and then also get light cover as well if they happen to be in the right place on the board. In theory, if you're being shot at by las cannons and things, you could still be saving them on a 2+ in the right circumstances, and you could even make them -1 to hit with Night Shroud as well, potentially. While I think they're usable, I still think that they have some pretty big weaknesses. The damage output isn't great versus things like Armour of Contempt or -1 damage units. They're not really that fast and can be avoided for a good few turns if the opponent needs to. They don't have Obsec, and they're not as hard to kill in combat as they are at range. Still though, an interesting unit, certainly not bad to have bullying towards objectives. Otherwise for Guard, they don't really have all that much more competition for melee units. Catachan Infantry can be quite good with strength 4 and +2 extra attacks from Iron Hands Draken and a Ministorum Priest. If you want to go maximum meme points, then a Baneblade with their adamantium tracks and crush them can hit on 2s and actually cause some quite serious damage. Though of course the entire galaxy trembles when a Death Corps of Kriegsmen takes up a shovel. Next up we've got the Demon Hunters. Most of the Grey Knight units do fight pretty hard in melee, though almost everything is really quite multi-threat, also dealing at least some damage at range and doing something useful in the psychic phase, so most units aren't actually entirely focused on combat. Perhaps for a unit that's just going to slog up the board and beat the opponent down though, the Paladins are kind of hard to beat for that role, 45 points per model, and for elite infantry aren't exactly the most expensive in the world, being fairly solid all-rounders, dealing out a fair bit of Stormbolter fire, casting a psychic power, and also have a fair bit of melee. Each model has 4 attacks with a Nemesis Force Sword, strength 5, AP 3 and damage 2. They'll be hitting on 2s as well, so quite accurate, and you could trade them out for the strength 6 halberds if desired. Really though, the reason that Paladins are good is that they're just a massive defensive brick. A 2+ Terminator save with Armour of Contempt is already great. They can very easily stack it with light cover, potentially using the Tide of Shadows for that. But then again, on top of that, they can also cast the Armoured Resilience spell from the Sanctic Discipline, giving them a further +1 to their saves. Again, like the Bulgrins, they could be hit by las cannons and still be tanking them on a 2+. Unless the opponent's got a lot of mortal wounds, some insane AP weapons, or masses of volume fire, they're going to be really hard to put down. Even a unit of 5 of them could be problematic. Perhaps one of their main weaknesses is that they don't get objectives secured, but you can potentially pick that up from a Warlord trait. Having a unit of these guys escorted by an apothecary up the board seems like a pretty reasonable play. They're a massive pain to put down, and if you can just regenerate them back on the board for a command point, then your opponent isn't going to enjoy that. Otherwise, just about everything else in the codex does fight kind of well. Strike squads with hammer hands do a lot of damage for the points. It might be kind of hard to deliver them though, so they tend to be a bit more of a counter-attack role. The interceptors can get the melee where it needs to go, but don't hit quite as hard without hammer hand. Otherwise, a Grandmaster Dread Knight can be a big threat in melee. He already does decent psychic and shooting as well, but then does have a bunch of very high power attacks and can get +1 to wound with a Warlord trait if he wants. Big stompy robot suits next. For the noble households of the Imperial Knights, I've chosen the Knight Gallant. Perhaps it slightly gets this by default, just because the rest of the Knights Codex tends to be fairly mixed role, combining powerful guns with decent combat. Gallants do seem to appear in competitive lists these days though. They're pretty much the cheap and sacrificial knight that you want to have just rushing at your opponent. They cause crazy amounts of damage with 5 attacks hitting on 2s, and then between chainsword and fists they actually have 4 different melee profiles that you can choose from, depending on which one's going to kill your target the most reliable. I noticed I've written that they can get triple attacks at AP3 and damage 1 with a chainsword. It's actually damage 2, not damage 1, and that'll run through a whole load of Space Marines. Potentially, if you're just trying to get the absolute maximal amount of damage out of a Gallant, then maybe House Griffith might not be the worst idea. They get +1 attack and a Warlord trait for advance and charge. Team that up with something like Sanctuary, and you've got a knight that's both annoying to put down, can get where it needs to go, and hit extra hard. They've got a whole bunch of damage boosting stratagems, and can potentially even use their Titanic feats to good effect. And then, in theory, because they're the knight that's just going to charge up, soak up all the fire, and then go down in a spectacular demise, they could be a good one to use that auto-explosion stratagem on. D6 mortal wounds to everything nearby could be absolutely game-changing. Otherwise, Armoured Warglaves are just a massively powerful unit all around. They've got a very nice shooting attack as well as their combat, but they can be made to move really fast with a Knight Errant, getting a 22-inch move then charge, and again they have quite a lot of combat buffs that can make them scarier. Finally, and perhaps a slightly unintentional thing from Games Workshop I think, is that the Questa Megara at the moment can do really well with Noble Combatants. Noble Combatants is that ability that allows them to get another attack with every attack that didn't inflict damage. It currently applies to the multi-attack profile on their claw, and it means that they can get an insane amount of damage out of that. They might FAQ that away at some point I think, but at the moment it remains incredibly ridiculously strong. Finally for the Imperium, I thought we'd just give a nod to the Assassins and the Inquisitors, and for Imperial Agents it's hard not to choose the Eversor Assassin. To be honest, he doesn't really have a lot of competition out of those. Most of the Inquisitors do have at least a little bit of melee threat, but tend to be more support pieces than anything else, and none of the other Assassins are really aimed to be a straight-out combat blender like he is. The Eversor is pretty much a straight-up light infantry hunter. He gets 3d6 charges out of Deep Strike, which is pretty reliable with a command point reroll. So you do potentially have a unit that can just pop up out of nowhere and pretty much murder an infantry squad. Typically, with the friends on, he's going to be getting 8 attacks on the charge. He can either use his Power Sword for Strength 5, AP3 and Damage 1, or his Claw for Strength 5, AP-1 and reroll wounds. And then he's also got the fun rule for each model that he slays, he actually gets to make another attack, making him even better against Damage 1 targets. He is good against anything with 1 wound, but if you have anything that's multi-wound, he does tend to be a bit more underwhelming, as then he's going to be getting far less attacks than he would be otherwise. Otherwise though, he's got a fun explosion rule on death, where he's got a good chance to deal some mortal wounds to enemies nearby but not friendlies, and he's got a few other stratagems for a 4+ feel no pain, a big fight again for 2 CP if he needs to clear out the other half of a big unit, and if he does happen to manage to kill an enemy character on the way, as an assassin that can generate UCP. Typically, assassins are still a bit of a niche side on the 40k battlefields. I think the Eversor is just not really quite general purpose enough to be regularly included. It could be quite good against 1-wound armies like maybe Sisters of Battle or perhaps Orks. Forces of Chaos next, and we'll start out with the Chaos Space Marines, a codex that really prefers melee to range on the whole, and is overflowing with combat options. As with quite a few armies in the game at the moment, I would still say that Terminators are one of the strongest picks out there. It does seem to be fairly near auto-include to take a big block of 10 Terminators with the Black Rune of Damnation, as a ridiculously hard threat to remove that can just stomp towards the middle objective and have enough melee threat to beat down any who challenge them. You can build the Terminators in a few different ways. You could just take cheap accursed weapons for 33 points, their Strength 5, AP3 and Damage 1 and +1 attack, so 4 attacks at base. A lot of people seem to like upgrading them to Power Fist or Chain Fist though you do have slight limitations as to how many of each you can take in the squad. On top of that, they can do a little bit of okay ranged fire, though I wouldn't say it's their main purpose. In general, as the biggest scariest core melee unit though, they can take all sorts of buffs from different characters. They can have 1 command point for +1 to hit and 2 command points for +1 to wound. A big squad somewhere in the army will almost certainly want the Black Rune of Damnation for a big -1 to wound on the whole squad, a crazy durability buff, and then with that massive durability on top of Armor of Contempt, you can put in a Master of Possession for +1 toughness and Pact of Flesh. Pact of Flesh healing a unit and also resurrecting one, so it makes them a super big nightmare to chew through. You might make the Mark of Slanesh for fighting first and access to that 5+ Feel No Pain spell. You could have a Dark Apostle with Illusory Supplication for hit roll debuffs, and never mind any of the Legion specific things, say for example Black Legion's +1 to hit, or the Word Bearer's reroll hits in combat. I think the general advice when you play against these is that if you don't have just some insane damage or loads of mortal wounds, it's probably just best to ignore them and let them have one objective. They do lack objective secured and can be a little bit on the slow side, which I guess will be their main weaknesses. Otherwise though, throughout Codex Chaos Space Marines there's so many other options. A Lord Discordant with Flames of Spite is a massive general purpose melee threat. Mortal wounds and rerolling wound rolls on loads of attacks is a great combo. A Demon Prince with the Hellforged Sword and Golax the Nurgle Relic is nice. That automatically wounds and ignores Feel No Pains and damage caps. Possessed and Warp Talons are both nice Demonkin units that work well with Master of Possessions. The Master of Executions is a really cheap 5e Elites character that gets mortal wounds to hit on 6s and has a bunch of quite nice synergies. Abaddon himself is an amazing buffing piece and will wreck the vast majority of things that he gets his hands on in melee as well. He can buff himself with his own rerolls. I think Chosen are a pretty viable alternative to Terminators as well. You pay a lot less for them and they can't take Power Fists, but they still have the same amount of melee damage, at least with the accursed weapons. And finally, even the troops can be fairly threatening. Accursed cultists are fairly general purpose and regenerate, and even legionaries with the Khorne upgrade can be pretty threatening. 40 attacks with strength 5 and AP -2 is going to rinse a lot of infantry. In general, Chaos lists are pretty good for getting up close and personal. Death Guard next, and they got really quite a lot of decent points cuts in the latest version of the points update. To be honest, I think their Codex melee options are pretty well balanced now, with lots of very viable options. There's 3 options that I would have been tempted to talk about in the first place slot, all of which seem to be making very regular appearances in competitive Death Guard lists doing well. Death Round Terminators are enormously durable and 50 points now, a 3-man murder squad that has 4 attacks hitting on 2s, and then the Man Reapers can either tailor to be good against elite infantry or get double the attacks to clear out chaff. They're really tough with toughness 5, a 2+ armor save, armor of contempt, a 4+ invul and -1 damage. Getting objectives secured as well means they can also help out on objectives while being main damage dealers. Plague Marines went from kind of rubbish to being a genuinely very threatening melee troop. For the points cost, I think they actually outfight Death Shroud Terminators just due to costing half the price and also getting some fun melee gear, but maybe just don't have quite the crazy survivability with 3 wounds and a 2+ save. Still though, their fill troop slots are also obsec, and the now free Great Plague Cleavers and Flails of Contagion are both enormously dangerous for the cost. 21 points for those kind of models is really scary. Lastly, for the big 3 that I think are really nice in melee is the Fleshmower Bloat Drone. These also went down in cost a fair bit and seems to have brought them right back into competitive lists. They're fairly fast for the Death Guard with 10-inch movement and fly. Their durability is okay with 9 wounds, the invul save and -1 damage. And their Grizzly Lawnmower melee is really quite threatening. 12 attacks at strength 7, AP 2 and damage 2 should cut through some elite infantry quite nicely. You can also heroic intervene them for a stratagem, making them quite nice to park on objectives. Seems like a fair few people are running them to put some more pressure on the opponents, and not just be very slowly slogging towards the board at 5 inches per turn. Otherwise though, also worthier of mention are Poxwalkers. They have a big mortal wound surprise with a couple of command points, particularly in the Terminus Est formation. It's pretty insane when you can average something like 10 mortal wounds coming out of 20 chaff models for 2 CP. Blight Lord Terminators maybe don't pack quite as much melee threat, but they're enormously durable and will be great for objectives. I think that the Death Guard Demon Prince is worth a mention. The Warp Insect Hive from Mortarian's Anvil gives him 4 rerolls, and that's well worthy of a mention. And of course Mortarian himself went down in points quite a bit. Still a bit worrying if you do wind up running up against something that can shoot him off the board, but in terms of 1-to-1 combatants in the game of 40k at the moment, there's very little that beats him. Thousand Sons next, and being the nerdiest of the traitor legions, most of the units tend to do better reading books and blasting you with mind bullets. In terms of true melee threatening units though, I think that the Chaos Spawn, the hideous masses of writhing tentacles and mutated flesh, they are actually pretty efficient in Thousand Sons lists and can add a bit of fairly expendable melee muscle. They do seem to be making it into rather a lot of Thousand Sons lists, at least competitively. maybe filling a role in the codex that very little does better, bullying other units in combat without having to worry too much about being supported. They move 7 inches, and you can potentially double move them with their psychic power. When they reach combat, they do hit on 4s, but they get 2d3 attacks at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 2, plus you get a random effect each turn, either AP 4, d3 extra attacks, or re-rolling wound rolls. For the 23 points, getting 4 wounds at toughness 5 isn't that bad a deal either. You can cast a psychic power on them for a 4+ invul, which goes further on them than just about anything else now Armour of Contempt is a thing. And if you do just need a little bit of more melee damage, you could use 1 command point for +1 attack, and you also get to choose your favourite out of the 3 mutations, depending on what unit you're fighting. Certainly enough to have them see play, and you can also field them in rather annoying units of 1 as well, if you just want to throw something expendable on an objective the opponent needs to deal with. Otherwise, in terms of combat troops, these Scarab Cult Terminators are dangerous enough. They do have a fair few attacks at strength 5, AP 3 and damage 2, and usually with all their durability, they'll make combat with a fair amount of models. Still though, I'd see them as a little bit more of a dual threat really, rather than just purely a combat unit. Often their shooting tends to be some of the most dangerous things, amped up with lots of buffs from psychic and stratagems, and even with moving twice with their psychic power, they might still struggle to get in melee threat range. They do move fairly slowly. Certainly a very solid unit all around, but I think it's kind of hard to label them as one of the very best melee units, as they're a bit more mixed role. Demons next, and we've already been seeing a fair few leaks and previews out of their upcoming codex. I'm sure they'll get far more scarier when that comes out. In the meantime though, the fast-moving Slaanesh Keeper of Secrets does remain one of the scariest melee powerhouses of the codex, 230 points base, and a ton of damage 3 attacks hitting on 2s and rerolling wound rolls of 1. They get 6 attacks with their Witstealer sword, and an extra 4 with those snapping claws. The damage output's pretty meaningful when you get to move very quickly with 14 inches and advance and charge with the Locus of Slaanesh. With a command point reroll or 2, and you could easily be making charges of 25 inches or more, and you might even be able to get even faster than that with certain other upgrades like the Exalted Rewards. There's one of those for extra speed, though I think a lot of the time it just makes sense to roll 2d6 on the table. A lot of the choices are pretty useful. The durabilities may be slightly so-so, 16 wounds with -1 to hit in melee, at least they get an invul save, and they do also bring a couple of psychic powers to the table, including things like a 6+ feel no pain, and the possibility of fighting twice if the opponent still engages them in your turn. Terrain and screening can still be a bit of an issue with those big bases, but with that movement they do have a ridiculously long threat range. Otherwise, for top demon combat units, Bellacor's got great damage and ignores invuls with that damage D3+3 sword of his, a serious worry to any individual unit that he engages. Bloodletter bombs can be kind of fun out of Deep Strike, chuck in a whole load of guys with strength 5 AP3 swords and to get a 3d6-inch charge with +1. And the combined Demon Prince and Herald pair that is Celeste gives some really big damage as well to whatever they get their hands on. They do a little bit of psychic and loads of buffs as well, but if they do get exposed to enemy return fire, they're going to go down quite quickly. I guess watch this space when the Demon's Codex is updated. We've already seen hints for damage 2 bloodletters, 4 attack demonettes with AP2, and all sorts of other scary stuff. Finally, for the Chaos armies, we have the Chaos Knights, and the brutal Wardog Carnivores have my vote for the scariest melee unit in the book. First up, they're really cheap for 140 points, so you're getting really quite a lot of wounds of fast-moving Obsec Knight onto the board. Their weapon skill 2+ with 5 attacks, similar to the Imperial Knight Gallants, and then again, like the Gallants, they've got multiple different profile choices, either a Slaughter Claw at 5 attacks at strength 12, AP3 and damage D3+3, or a Chain Talon with double the attacks at strength 6 and AP3. They get even more ludicrously threatening in Iconoclast for an extra attack and an extra pip of AP on top of all that. There aren't all that many targets that they're not going to deal some serious damage to. Then with the Knight books, the order of the day is that they can put all sorts of buffs onto these Knights. You can get demonic gifts like the Blood Shield to ignore invuls, Dread Knight for some feel no pain, or Beguiling Majesty for extra toughness in combat. They can deliver those dread abilities to the heart of the enemy army, perhaps better than most of the other Knights, all sorts of fun shenanigans that are on offer there. They've got some nice damage and defense support stratagems like 1 command point rotate ion shields, and they have a little bit of shooting as well, either with havoc launchers or heavy stubbers. They're great frontline expendable units though, can afford to push up the board and utterly rip something to bits in close combat, and it doesn't matter too much if they die with their cheap cost. I would say that they're probably the best of the Chaos Knight Codex combat wise, though the other war dogs with mixed range and melee still are very threatening. The Knight Rampager can be built up to some insane scary proportions as well. similar stats to the Gallants, and arguably a few other melee synergies from the Chaos Codex. And finally, the Knight Abominant shouldn't be underestimated in combat. It's really tough with the 5+ Feel No Pain from the Psychic spell, and if you combine the Iconoclast buff with their Psychic power for mortal wounds and wound roll buffs, then it's going to be hitting a lot of things with that great big flail of its. Next we come to the Xenos armies, and we'll start out with Craftworlds and the Aspect Warriors with the Howling Banshees. A squad of these is quite a common choice in a Craftworlds list, fairly fragile glass cannon infantry units with a whole ton of supporting special rules, and potentially quite a good target for buffs as well. They move 8 inches base, get to advance and charge for a very big threat range for infantry, they cancel Overwatch, and you could maybe even feed in extra movement with them with things like Strands of Fate for advance rolls. They may be an okay choice to have piling out of a Wave Serpent as well, that could further increase their threat range even more. Their Banshee Blades are kind of okay stats, 3 attacks at Strength 4, AP 3 and Damage 1, but they then just combine them with all sorts of buffs, +1 to wound, enemy units can't overwatch or interrupt, and the Exarch can often do as much damage as the rest of the squad combined. Taking Mirror Swords for 8 attacks and Whirling Death for damage 2 means that she's going to be cutting through Space Marines like no tomorrow. As with just about everything else Craftworld, lending a hand with some Farseers or Warlocks will make them go a lot further. Doom is really nice to combine with that +1 to wound for getting all those low strength attacks through, and things like Guide or Jinx won't hurt either. When they're exposed though, even with a -1 to hit, they're still going to die pretty easily. 19 points is a lot for a toughness 3 body. Perhaps other competitors could be the Striking Scorpions, maybe not so very different, but skewed more towards mortal wounds with their Mantiblasters, and a Biting Blade Crushing Blow Exarch seems to be one of the most popular choices. Wraith Blades with axes and shields give Eldar some actual durability that they can move forward with, combine great with Fortune, never mind all the other psychic buffs, and Shining Spears move very quickly indeed, potentially jumping from deployment zone to the other deployment zone, shooting a whole bunch of stuff and following up with a Laser Lance charge. Drukhari next, and for best melee unit in the Codex, I had to give it to Drazar Master of Blades. Even despite his points being nerfed since the Codex came out, it's been pretty much a staple in the vast majority of Drukhari lists ever since. He's a very easy to use melee powerhouse. He's going to be effective against literally just about every unit in the entire game. He's got 6 attacks at Strength 6, AP 3 and Damage 3 with +1 to wound. He can drop down to Strength 5 and Damage 2 if the +2 attacks makes more difference, and if he is the Warlord he gets to reroll all hit and wound rolls as well, so you're going to be converting most of those. Then if the squad isn't quite dead enough, then he just casually gets to fight again at every fight phase. Ludicrously dangerous in combat compared with a lot of other characters, I think. On top of that, it's easy to deliver with power from pain granting advance and charge and jumping out of fast moving transports. For a Drukhari he's at least reasonably survivable, a 4+ invul, a 2+ save and -1 damage. He's also got the Incubi ability to have a chance to make enemies fight last with Tormentors, and buffs nearby Incubi as well with +1 to wound, making them yet more effective. Overall, well worth the points cost. He can easily be killing his own weight in elite infantry in a single turn. Drukhari certainly enjoy their knives and gladiatorial weapons though. Loads of other good threats in the Codex for combat. A Succubus with buffed up relics and traits like the Triptych Whip, Precision Blows, Competitive Edge, and Grave Lotus Toxin. Pick your favourite cocktail of those and off you go. An Archon can be excessively fighty with the Gym Blade, fights twice by being a Master Archon, and maybe reroll hits and wounds on his Warlord trait as well if Drazar doesn't happen to be using it or he doesn't want the fights last. And outside of the characters, things like Hellions have big threat, so do Incubi, particularly next to Drazar, and Grotesque with their big cleavers are nice as well. On to the Harlequins, perhaps an army without the most amount of unit choice, but the standard troops can certainly pack a massive punch. They're 13 points a model normally, though if you do want to upgrade them for combat, you'd typically want to go to 18 points, and then as their faction is known for, they're really easy to deliver. An 8-inch move base, they get to advance and charge, and they have fast and fairly annoying transports to take out that they can jump out of with ease. If you do upgrade them with combat weapons, then they're Strength 4, AP 2 and Damage 2, and each of the Kiss, Caress and Embrace all give you a different flavour of mortal wound or extra damage stratagem that can allow a squad with a whole bunch of attacks to punch up very hard. On top of that, they can be fairly threatening in the shooting phase with a couple of fusion pistols along. They're kind of annoying to remove and return, both with their panoply and the Sedath of Light, and they've got loads of tricksy stratagems for dealing damage, extra defense, or punishing enemies that try and fall back. Being Auspex troops is just icing on the cake. Otherwise, and potentially a bit more of a dedicated melee threat, the Troop Master I think I could have easily talked about. There's several different fairly fun builds that you can make with those. You can have Segarax Rose or one of the Relic Blades. There's a couple of traits that can give you extra damage, and also the very nice one that allows you to get that massive +6 inches to charges, near guaranteeing him just about any charge that he wants. The Solitaire is perhaps a little bit lesser used, but I wouldn't underestimate one when he's using that blitz. Onto the bio-horrors of the Tyranids next, and first here I've ranked the alpha leader beast that is the Winged Hive Tyrant. Very happy to occasionally take a break from leading the swarms to go and cut through the opponent's biggest threat with a crazy big bone sword. You're not going to be able to stay away from this thing for too long with a big 17-inch move and fly, particularly if you bring some Tyrant Guard along, then it can position itself quite well far up the board without worrying about being shot. Then at base it's got 5 attacks with the monstrous bone sword, which is strength 10, AP 4 and damage 3. Quite good to start with, plus you get a tail reroll and some extra attacks for its claws below. What seems to be the default take on these guys is to upgrade that bone sword to the Reaper of Obliterax, 1 mortal wound for every successful wound roll that you inflict, and you can't use any abilities that ignore you taking wounds, things like Feel No Pains or Damage Caps, very relevant when you've got Catan or Abaddon in the mix. Then, just to truly make sure that your opponent's dead, you can spend 1 CP for an extra D3 attacks with the Adrenal Gland stratagem, that's 7 attacks with that crazy threatening profile, and in theory once you've killed whatever you charge, you can then use Overrun to return to safety behind the Hive Guard after deleting something very scary. A horribly threatening unit to have jumping out and killing things. For psychic powers you can just use extra damage from Smite, or things like Catalyst or Onslaught, both of which are great. Plus you can get further buffs from being from a certain Hive fleet, or using Warlord traits which we haven't even talked about so far. After the balanced data slate they did make a few weaknesses for him. He did go up in points a little bit, plus if he dies and he's your Warlord, then you lose your Synaptic Imperatives, which will be a pretty massive blow. Ideally you'd need to have him jumping about, destroying important things, but also remaining safe if at all possible. Otherwise, throughout the Codex, plenty of other cool things. Tyranid warriors with bone swords are hard to shift and have a lot of general purpose damage 2 attacks. Really quite an easy unit to layer stacking buffs on if you want. Carnifexes are interesting core units, both the regular versions and the streamer killers are quite fun. And Raveners are a different flavour of warrior really, moving a bit faster and with different combat weapons, though they don't get objective secured. Next up, for their worshipping cultists, we have the Genestealer Cults, and for these many armed mutants I was a little bit torn for which way to go. The Acolyte Hybrids and Pure Strain Genestealers I both think are really quite cool. The Acolyte Hybrids are a bit more of a pure melee damage unit. They are a core OBSEC troops unit that you can just use in multiple small units for popping up and doing objectives and things, but you can also build around them as a very scary damage dealing squad, tooling them up with a whole load of rock weapons. Genestealer Cult have got lots of sneaky tricks for getting to combat, potentially popping out of reserve at 8-inch charges, or maybe near an Icon Ward for 7-inch, or they could also pile out of some Goliath trucks too. The base cultists get 3 attacks at strength 4, AP 2 and damage 1, though usually the real things to fear in the squad tend to be those heavy rock weapons. The drills have got a really interesting profile, and perhaps my favourite, strength times 2, AP 4 and damage 1, they auto wound the target, and also just to add insult to injury, every 6 that you roll to hit causes 2 mortal wounds in addition to normal damage. If you roll a bunch of 6s, then that's something that's just going to be dead right then and there. The other 2 are both usable though, the swords for damage 2 or the cutters for damage 3 but -1 to hit, and as a core unit they can take a lot of buffs, things like +1 attacks or rerolls from the Primarch, and potentially proficient planning for our time is nigh, getting +1 attack on the first time that they strike. That's really powerful on the rock weapons. On top of that, they can be really scary with shooting as well, with hand flamers and the crossfire special rule. Getting +1 to wound with loads of strength 3 auto hits will melt things just through sheer volume of fire. Overall, a solid enough unit, even if they do die to a stiff breeze when they're attacked back. Otherwise though, the Genestealers themselves, the pure strains for 14 points per model, are really quite interesting. 4 attacks at weapon skill 2+, strength 4, AP 3 and damage 1 should blend most infantry, and they become a lot more general purpose and twisted helix with strength 5. They're fast with an 8-inch movement and advance and charge, and a single unit with the They Came From Below proficient planning upgrade I think is in very near auto-include territory for the Genestealer Cults. That upgrade can give them a first turn pre-game move to basically almost guarantee a first turn charge, or they can go back into reserve and attempt an 8-inch charge later in the game. In general they're still not all that durable for the points cost, though with a 4+ invul occasionally you can get lucky and just roll very high and them not die even when they should. Otherwise, a fair few interesting other units in the Genestealer Cult Codex. Perhaps one of the biggest other standout units could be a stacked up Patriarch with damage 3 from Twisted Helix perhaps. Quite a nice powerhouse in the centre of the army that's easy to keep safe and can also provide some helpful psychic powers. Next up are the Tau, an army that should famously be doing very badly on this list. Certainly in general, the vast majority of their army typically want to be avoiding combat like the plague, but they do certainly have this slightly memey commander build who can certainly lay the smack down in melee. Take a Cold Star commander for some very far movement, so decent threat range. Give him the Onager Gauntlet for strength 12, AP -4 and damage 3 melee, 4 attacks hitting on 3s normally. Then take a Tau Flamer that's been upgraded to the Thermoneutronic Projector, and that one will give you an extra d6+2 attacks in combat at strength 4, AP2 and damage 2. That already gives you a unit that could bully some medium infantry not too badly, but then you can also double down on that with the Warlord trait to reroll hits and wounds both at range and in melee. And with that, you've got a commander that's got a pretty reasonable chance of taking out an entire small squad of Space Marines in a single round of combat. Combine that with the fact that you can also be packing another 2 or 3 very scary guns as well, and those ones can also reroll all hits and wounds, and you've got a bit of a powerhouse commander on your hands. Admittedly not very tough to reprisals though if you can't keep him safe after. At least on paper he does seem like a bit of a fun unit to use, but commander slots are at a bit of a premium in the Tau Empire Codex these days. A lot of people prefer the powerful buffing rules or more range damage loadouts, though I think that this guy still looks fun. Otherwise, as I mentioned, not really all that much going on in the rest of the Codex. Crews can bully light infantry fairly well with strength 4 and AP -1 attacks, and Commander Farsight does have his Dawnblade as well. Fight's pretty strong for a Tau, though nothing particularly enormously crazy compared with other factions' HQ choices. Unlike the Tau, Orky units like close combat so much that they get kind of annoyed if they just have to sit around doing Daka and aren't allowed to break things. I think melee Orc units have been a lot more interesting since those WAR updates. Now they get invul saves and +1 strength on top of the advance and charge and extra attacks, and they have made a more combat focused Orc list a lot more interesting. Looking at a few recent Orc tournament lists, Squighog boys certainly seem to be present in the vast majority of them in pretty big numbers. I guess they are one of the units that have most benefited from this extra survivability and extra strength. The Squig-mounted cavalry get 3 wounds at toughness 6 with a 4+ save and a 6+ invul, and they also have a transhuman physiology type stratagem, so it does make them quite hard to take out. They're fairly fast at 10-inch movement and can advance and charge in the turn of the war, though admittedly their cavalry bases might be a bit annoying with terrain. Weapons wise, in combat they're usually going to be striking with strength 6, AP2 and damage 2, 3 attacks apiece, and combining Goths with the War, they can get up to strength 8, which is quite nice, and then they can follow them up with a few attacks with the Squighog Jaws, 2 more attacks at strength 6, AP1 and damage 2. Overall, I think that is quite impressive for a mere 25-point model, particularly one that moves fast and is at least somewhat tough. Otherwise, there's plenty of other things that they can do, a little bit of shooting from the sticker, they can potentially bring some bomb squigs along for some mortal wounds, and as beast snaggers they do a little bit better against things like vehicles and monsters. Goths will make just about anything a little bit fightier in melee with extra strength and exploding 6s, and they can also get some character buffs too, things like +1 to hit or that warpath power. Overall, are pretty usable and threatening units for fairly cheap. Some people do seem to be building out to units of 5 of them, or just using multiple units of 3 for a unit that can bully enemies pretty well, and also are fairly expendable if you happen to lose them. Like everything in Orcs, morale can be a bit of an issue for these guys, only being leadership 6 makes it particularly painful if you lose one. Otherwise though, most of the rest of the Orc Codex is hungering to get into battle as quickly as possible. You can make generic war bosses very fighty for the points cost, give them brutal but cunning, and maybe the relic like the Kill Chopper or the Killer Claw. It means that every time you don't get an attack through to damage phase, you get to come back and have another go, and that is pretty brutal. Now they've all lowered in cost, I think that most of the boys are a lot more credible to be putting on the table. Beast snaggers, regular boys, commandos and storm boys. They're still not all that tough despite toughness 5 with the amount of high strength weapons going around, but at least losing them isn't quite as painful as it was before. Otherwise, Ghazghkull's making his way into quite a lot of lists, maybe partly as much for his buffing abilities as Great War as well as his melee threat. Characters with wound caps can be annoying to put down though, I guess, and Meganobs aren't bad as Orc Shock elites. I kind of feel like they could be a unit that Games Workshop could give Armour of Contempt to at some point. Would be nice to have them on the same playing field as the rest of the Terminators, even if they don't have an invul. Finally, last but by no means least, we come to the Necrons, a faction that went from kind of very underwhelming to top tier between Games Workshop's many changes to them, and also giving them very easy secondaries. For perhaps the top combat unit, I think I'd still go for Scorpec Destroyers, 30 points each, very blendy damage dealers, with a whole load of high AP hyperphase attacks. 1 out of every 3 of them gets a Reap Blade for the big 3 attacks at Strength 7, AP 4 and Damage 3, and then the other 2 get Threshers, 4 attacks at Strength 5 and Damage 2. If it makes sense against the right target, you can buff them with +1 Strength via Stratagem, or maybe use a Plasma Sight for both +1 Strength and +1 attack. Plasma Sights do seem to be pretty credible to run alongside them. Defensively, I think they're alright with Toughness 5 and a 3+ save. They do have that excellent -1 to wound stratagem, which is almost auto-used for 1 CP. You're going to prevent a whole load of damage that way. They gained Core a while back, so can take lots of character buffs, Chronomancers for invuls and charge rerolls, Technomancers for healing and resurrecting dead models, an Overlord for Relentless March, and maybe My Will Be Done, or maybe moving up somewhere near to the Silent King, as full wound rerolls are going to hit very hard indeed. Finally, with the new command protocols as well, you could potentially even be in the Hungry Void all game for +1 strength on the first round of combat. Strength 5 Threshers and Strength 8 Reap Blades sound great to me. I'd say out of battle line melee units they're probably one of the best, though there's loads of other strong stuff out there. The Silent King himself is certainly no slouch, excellent command abilities, but he has lots of decent melee attacks and makes enemies fight last, and he also gets to reroll all of his wounds in melee. Wraiths and Lich Guard both have slightly less damage output, but are very hardy with their 4+ invuls. Quite nice at using that very competitive Necron dynasty with pre-game moves and Obsec on everything. The Katana worth a shout. The Nightbringer can delete just about any one threat in the game if he gets his hands on it. The Transcendents and the Void Dragons are both good too. I still feel that Flayed ones are maybe a touch underrated. 10 points per model that's just as tough as a Necron warrior is and can get very similar buffs. Maybe a little bit more viable in Novok though, where they get their boosted Hungry Void, better AP, and a pretty helpful stratagem. So I think that just about brings us to the end of our journey through some of the best units in melee in the entirety of Warhammer 40k. Lots of scary stuff out there, and just about every faction has something at least some way credible. I'd say maybe if I had to pick some of the very best of the best, maybe things like the Blood Angels Sanguinary Guard, the Sisters Repentia and the Zephyrim for the Adepta Sororitas, and perhaps the Reaper of the Obliterax Hive Tyrants might be some of my top picks. In any case, I look forward to hearing all your thoughts down in the comments below. Do you agree with my choices, or are there other things that you think you'd rank higher? Always open to alternate takes, any other ideas how you can get more out of these, or just any fun stories as to the carnage that these have caused on the table. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k stuff coming, with new videos out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention as well that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and that's how I can spend so much time making videos like this about Warhammer gameplay. If you have been enjoying a lot, then any support is enormously appreciated. Big long projects like this do take a lot of time and effort to make. If you would like to help support, channel patrons do get a fair few rewards, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.